A sad Prince William and a visibly disturbed Princess Catherine appeared in front of the cameras, and the entire world stopped. They told a truth no one was ready to hear, their voices shaking and their weight resonating across every regal hall. A devastating disclosure that shocked advisors, broke protocol, and threw the public into a state of mourning and conjecture. However, this was just the start. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. Rumors weren't the first thing. There was no leak in the beginning. There was silence at first, the sort of quiet that is too purposeful to be innocuous, too heavy to be usual. Then, out of nowhere, William and Catherine showed up, not in joy, not in assurance, but in sorrow. This was strange for a family that had been taught to remain steadfast in the face of adversity and grin through agony. This was not an example of royal duty. Inside a regal script that was never intended for sadness, this was a raw moment of human suffering as people tried to live. The weight of someone who has practiced the words but was unable to rehearse the feeling behind them was evident on Prince William's face. He didn't raise his voice like a prince saying something important. In an attempt to keep from collapsing in front of the world, it cracked like a father and a husband, Catherine as well. It appeared as though Catherine had been trying to keep herself together for days or even weeks, putting power into her posture as something inside of her broke down. Not only did her eyes appear exhausted, but they also had a haunted appearance, as if she had battled valiantly to preserve a truth and ultimately lost. The line that made everything chilly then appeared. We requested a privacy statement intended to deflect attention as soon as they confirmed it wasn't a little upgrade or a brief setback. Nada. It was intimate. It was terrible. And it had a direct connection to their family's heart. They claimed that the catastrophe had affected them in a way that was impossible for anyone outside the gates of the palace to completely comprehend. However, the feeling conveyed more than words could, even before they went into additional detail. The sort of sorrow that remains after the camera cuts away. People are rewritten by that type of grief. The announcement was not the only thing that stunned the country. It was the speed with which it arrived, the urgency of its delivery. Because unless absolutely necessary, the monarchy does not move quickly. Unless anything has already started to go wrong behind the scenes, routine is not broken. This royal moment was not prearranged. This was dignified damage control. This was a traditional crisis, and it was felt by all. The world erupted in a matter of seconds. Phones glowed. The newsroom hurried. Disbelief erupted on social media. Theories and names spread more quickly than the official statement could complete. People were panicked, not only responding, because something felt incomplete in some way. The palace seemed to be making a statement, without giving away everything. It was terrified because of that. Their remarks didn't seem as loud as the spaces between them. The silences, the swallowing, William's forward gaze, as if he were attempting to maintain a firm grip. Catherine's refusal to let go would have meant losing everything. It was already recognized within the royal walls. Just prior to the public announcement, the family had received a briefing, as though the organization had finally come to terms with the fact that it could no longer be concealed. Whatever was going on had gotten so bad that even stillness was becoming hazardous. However, the public was left staring at the same question that was consuming everyone's thoughts outside those walls. What took place? What catastrophe might compel the future monarchs to take such a prominent role? They appeared as though their world had suddenly fallen apart. And why did it seem like they were only revealing the tip of the iceberg? Like if something more profound was still hidden behind palace walls, just waiting to blow up? Even though this announcement was shocking, it didn't feel like the whole picture. It seemed like the beginning of something much larger, something that the monarchy had been frantically attempting to preserve. However, Underlying their calm exteriors and practiced speech was a more sinister reality, a long-forgotten secret that now poses a threat to the foundation of the monarchy. Insiders understood the sorrow had started long before the announcement, even though the world only saw two royals in mourning. For months, there were cryptic messages in official diaries, discreet medical appointments, whispers in the palace halls, and mysterious absences. Now everyone's attention was focused on the couple's invisible struggle, while everyone else looked on in disbelief. There was little delay until the timetable began to make sense. Once written off as exhaustion or schedule issues, Catherine's absence from the spotlight was suddenly seen differently. Silent cancellations, unusually long wait times, and that one terrifying occasion when William went to a big function by himself, his replies abnormally short, his grin obviously forced. There had been a quiet war going on behind closed doors. Only a few senior aides were apparently aware of the full gravity of Catherine's health, which had become a highly guarded affair. The palace, which is renowned for its ability to manipulate narratives, moved quickly to bind employees with NDAs and hide any indication of weakness from the public. However, nothing is ever truly hidden. A delicate and worsening state was suggested by leaked emails and texts exchanged between senior officials and palace physicians. The connotation was clear even though the specifics were still unclear. The royal staff was frantically trying to contain the serious problem. Maintaining appearances had become an intolerable burden. Given his reputation for being duty-bound, William started to discreetly withdraw from some interactions. Though few publicly questioned it, his absence from important Commonwealth meetings raised concerns. In retrospect, those lost moments were more about survival than process. Insiders were particularly troubled by the emotional fallout that seeped through Kensington's walls, rather than just the medical emergency. According to reports, Prince George, who is usually calm in public, had sobbed during a private school assembly. Counseling visits have increased, according to staff. No parent was prepared to respond to the queries posed by the youngest children. Not only was William and Catherine under royal pressure, but they were also under parental pressure. And the problem was cruel. Keep quiet and preserve the strength impression, or raise your voice and run the danger of shattering the illusion that the monarchy has so diligently tried to maintain. The announcement was a break in the royal facade, not merely a statement. They were stuck in a pressure cooker and cried out for help. A choice made out of love rather than obligation that surprised the establishment. However, the devastation had already started within the palace. Panic spread, trust was undermined, and the narrative that had previously been within their control suddenly eluded them. The next disclosure would break through royal reticence and reveal the core of the monarchy's conflict with reality as rumors grew. Love pleaded for honesty, but duty commanded silence. William and Catherine were put to the greatest test within the palace walls, not as royalty, but as parents. It wasn't only a royal admission that followed. The appeal cut through centuries of custom and was incredibly human. Following the announcement, the couple struggled with a decision that was much more complicated than headlines could convey, while the public tried to put together bits and pieces of the truth. William and Catherine had been arguing, fighting, and even debating whether the weight of silence was still worth bearing for weeks. The price had become too high, and it was now crushing not just them, but also their kids. It was strategic as well as emotional. Every action had repercussions. Speaking would put the crown's reputation at risk. However, remaining silent would be like being choked by a delusion. Catherine started to fall apart because she was torn between her instincts as a mother and her duties as a queen. When George questioned why the truth wasn't being conveyed to the world, no predetermined statement could console him. She couldn't be put to sleep at night by any protocol. The voices clashed behind the curtain. Ever mindful of her reputation and customs, Queen Camilla reportedly insisted that the matter be kept confidential. According to a top aide, she stressed that the monarchy must continue. Truth was a threat to Camilla, a chance for anarchy. However, truth had turned into a lifeline for Catherine. Princess Anne emerged as an unexpected pillar amid this storm. Known for her straightforward manner, she subtly emerged as Catherine's strongest supporter. Ceremonies and theatrics didn't appeal to Anne. The families, Catherine's, and survival all piqued her curiosity. "You're not just producing heirs, you're raising human beings," she said to her. King Charles attempted to strike a balance between the two. He was aware of the harm that unbridled emotion may cause to the organization. A controlled disclosure was what he wanted, a product of royal press teams, tempered by distance and time. However, William and Catherine had had enough waiting. They had had enough of acting like nothing was wrong. Pressure or strategy did not sway the scales. It was a letter. Diana retrieved a forgotten envelope from a box she had left behind. She was conflicted about motherhood and the monarchy. At the time she wrote the succinct but impactful letter, she wrote, "If fear ever silences you, keep in mind that your kids speak louder than you do." Uncanny timing prevailed. It was a shattering impact. Catherine found the clarity she needed in that letter, and William got the fire from it. They all agreed that it was right to tell the world, not because it was safe. Insiders understood otherwise, even if the palace rushed to portray their action as a component of a larger communication strategy. This was not planned. A breakout occurred. An intentional and passionate act of defiance against a system that valued secrecy over healing. However, a startling document that reframed everything we believed to be true surfaced just as the announcement was coming to an end. A sealed document that had never been intended for public view reappeared from a secret archive known as Sovereign Contingency. Its contents were explosive, in addition to being delicate. They attested that the reported catastrophe was both personal and constitutional. Someone with access, someone who had had enough, was the source of the leak. Investigative journalists discovered a paper branded for internal use only and bearing the royal cipher thanks to an anonymous tip. The establishment was rocked by its title alone, Heir Viability and Long-Term Stability in the Succession Risk Report. It had a clinical tone. However, what it revealed was disastrous. Redacted names and coded references within its pages suggested a medical evaluation of a younger person rather than King Charles or William. The pages discussed expected psychological difficulties, public-facing limits, and developmental abnormalities with caution, as they were much younger. But Louis was the name that kept coming up beneath the linguistic bureaucracy. The youngest of William and Catherine's children, Prince Louis, was always thought of as the happy wild card among the three royal children. However, this file showed that there was more to the carefully chosen images of the palace. According to reports, a number of internal analyses had come to the conclusion that, should the conventional line of succession be maintained, there would be long-term repercussions that could threaten to undermine public trust in the stability of the monarchy. The monarchy had known when asked. Senior royals have been gathering behind closed doors for weeks, maybe months, to talk about the unthinkable. What if Louis was unable to carry out his royal responsibilities later on? What if the truth finally came out despite his best efforts to control his public persona? What would happen if the crown had to undertake the unimaginable choice to covertly avoid a legitimate heir? There were rumors that a plan had already been written. Under the guise of ceremonial rationale, there may be changes to the succession order and title adjustments. However, none of it had been made public, since doing so would create a constitutional nightmare. The announcement from William and Catherine followed, raw, emotional, and instantaneous, but not in accordance with palace time or organized through formal channels. The perspective on that choice was completely different now. Was it an appeal for compassion, or a premeditated attempt to outwit the crown's own covert maneuvering? Overnight, the atmosphere in Buckingham Palace changed. It appeared more like a preemptive strike, an act of rebellion against an institution that had started making plans for their child's future without their consent. Then what had previously been perceived as a sorrowful, passionate speech, everything was altered by the leak. Suspicion replaced the public's sorrow. Was this tragedy being treated as damage management, or was it actually being handled with compassion? By the hour, the number of questions increased. The Crown began to feel intolerable pressure. Because the story became uncontrollable the instant the secret file was revealed. The sorrow was no longer limited to a family. The monarchy itself was on the verge of a constitutional catastrophe. Now that the stability of the monarchy was in doubt, the Crown needed to move quickly. The following event was a unique royal summit. The leaders of the monarchy convened in Balmoral under a shroud of darkness. Just the burden of centuries and a single question on the table. No cameras, no journalists. How can the Crown be safeguarded without compromising the truth? It wasn't a coincidence. The conference was called less than 48 hours after the release of the secret file, at a time when the monarchy was already losing control of its story. Arrivals were spaced out. 4 characters, Charles, Anne, Edward, and Camilla, each bringing a unique perspective of crisis, control, and allegiance, were flown in under extreme secrecy. Normally a haven, the air in Balmoral had become frigid with consequence. Catherine was conspicuously missing. She declined. Not because she wasn't invited. She made it plain, a close aide said. "My kids are where I belong." Not in a room like a chessboard, discussing their destiny. A message more powerful than any speech was sent by her absence. She refused to compromise the humanity of her child. Tensions immediately increased within the estate. Already tense from days of mental trauma, William came into the room not as a prince, but rather as a father who had gone too far. He went straight to his father and demanded that the deliberate, methodical silence in the palace end. The contentious discussion was about suffering rather than politics. Torn between duty and affection, Charles attempted to preserve equilibrium in a story of a son who felt abandoned by the same institution he was supposed to uphold. He was adamant that something must be done, but not quickly. For him, every choice had consequences that went well beyond feelings, and every word had historical resonance. However, William didn't want echoes since he was raw and irritated. He desired truthfulness. Halfway through the evening, legal teams were invited to participate in the conversation. Emergency succession addendum drafts, which included skipping heirs in certain situations, were discreetly placed on the table. Black and white, there it was. The Crown is getting ready to potentially avoid Louis. No votes, no public consultation, just signatures, conditions, and ink awaiting approval. According to reports, Queen Camilla, who has always protected the monarchy's reputation, was adamant. Protect the family, protect the crown, protect the name. Her stance remained unwavering. Structure cannot be rewritten by feeling. Others in the room, however, weren't so sure. Tradition was not the only thing at stake. The goal was to keep people safe. Then, in a rare flash of insight, Anne spoke with a force that defied convention. "Let's avoid what happened to Diana," she remarked. There was silence in the room. Her remarks were a warning, not a conjecture, a reminder that silence, masquerading as strength, can be punished by history. They drew lines. The balance of power changed. Trust broke down. The goal of the Balmoral meeting was survival, not unification. And one reality became indisputable as the night went on. The institution was crumbling under the weight of its own secrecy, not simply external pressures. However, the public's response was turning into something much more deadly and unpredictable, even as the royal inner circle struggled to contain the damage. Anger replaced grief. Loyalty gave way to uncertainty. Once ardent defenders of the crown, the British people started to seek explanations. Protests broke out outside the palace gates. Petitions grew, and Catherine and William became improbable icons of defiance in the middle of the chaos. What had begun as grief soon turned into something much more explosive. The public now saw the carefully constructed image of a stable, cohesive royal family for what it was. Not a mistake, not a miscommunication. A cover-up, however. Furthermore, the populace had had enough of being kept in the dark. It seemed subtle at first. Outside Kensington Palace, there were silent vigils, flowers, handwritten tributes, and pictures of the kids. However, those candlelit meetings had turned into large-scale protests by the third night. The crowds grew. Chants rang out from both Balmoral and Buckingham's gates. They weren't merely lamenting the suffering of a youngster. They insisted that it belonged to the monarchy. People weren't the only ones. Famous actors, journalists, and even lawmakers started speaking out in a matter of days. Supporting responses flooded in, lauding William and Catherine's courage. The crown was the focus of popular scrutiny rather than adoration, demonstrating their humanity and readiness to break royal silence for the first time in decades. A collective rage erupted on social media. Global trends saw the rise of hashtags like #LetWilliamSpeak and #ProtectTheHairs. Clarity was demanded in comments on every regal post. Palace silence was being analyzed by every news outlet. The noise outside increased for each hour that the monarchy remained silent. Then the video appeared. A brief 20-second video that was leaked showed a young Princess Charlotte crying in a school hallway while surrounded by aides. Her tears and bewilderment were all too real. Even though the video was obviously not intended for public consumption, it was enough to crush people's hearts all throughout the nation. No longer was it about royal roles. Children caught in the storm were the subject of the story. All of a sudden, this was more than a problem. There was a movement. Grassroots activists started mobilizing support for both transformation and openness. They requested that the ancient regulations that required sacrifice, silence, and secrecy be abandoned and that the monarchy be reimagined. William was in the core of this momentum, not voluntarily, but out of necessity. The sound of whispers increased. Would the populace tolerate Charles's continuing rule following such a severe breach in confidence? Is it time for William to take charge, not rebelling? However, the concept was no longer fringe in renewal. The polls changed. The public's trust in King Charles fell, and the pressure grew intolerable as the distance increased, because the royal family was dealing with more than just opposition from within the palace gates this time. Millions of people were against them. A country bound together not by custom, but by indignation. A worldwide audience that insisted that the monarchy change or face extinction. The pressure on King Charles screamed from every screen and street, no longer coming from behind closed doors. The letter then arrived. A long-forgotten handwritten letter from Diana, Princess of Wales, surfaced from a locked box kept by her former attorney. The letter, which was written 2 weeks before to her death, foreshadowed the exact turning point that William and his family were now at. It was released during a terrifying time. Diana's voice, which had been silent for decades, reappeared in the conversation just as the country was split and the monarchy was on the verge of moral collapse. However, it wasn't a public declaration, a memoir, or even a message. It was intimate and private. The message was brief, a mother's concerns encapsulated in ink and temporarily concealed. However, every phrase sounded like a thunderclap. Diana tweeted, "If truth ever brings my boys to tears, let them lead with it," which has already gone viral. It was a straightforward yet significant message, a permit, a blessing, a forecast, one that seemed to address every query around William's choice to defy convention and candidly discuss his family's suffering. Its legitimacy was promptly verified by handwriting analyzers. Everything matched: the tilt, the ink, and the flow. It was unquestionably hers. Additionally, the impact on public opinion was instantaneous. Where there had been indignation, there was now respect. Clarity appeared where doubt had previously existed. Diana wasn't merely remembered. She was placed back at the heart of the contemporary royal issue. Photographers caught an unguarded moment. William in his garden by himself, cradling the letter. His eyes were sad. He shakes his hands. He wasn't reading it for the cameras. For strength, he was reading it. For guidance. The now iconic image became a symbol of generational rebellion as it spread like wildfire. A prince who would no longer bear suffering in quiet. The letter's appearance within the palace destroyed the last vestige of authority. Charles is said to have cried when he read it, not at meetings or in front of advisors, but in private, behind closed doors. Insiders claimed that the statements were painful not only because they came from Diana, but also because they brought back memories of the exact thing he had attempted to repress: royalty's human cost. In contrast, Camilla is said to have discarded the letter as a diversion. Even her closest associates, however, sensed the change. The public opinion court had made a lasting change. The monarchy never fully recovered from the scars Diana's comments had caused, and now they were bleeding in front of the world, in real time. The palace made an effort to control the consequences. Proposals were written. It was decided to contact historians. However, the harm had already been done. This was no longer a PR disaster. This was a spiritual reckoning. It was not the crown that the populace had selected. It was the legacy of the woman who, in their opinion, never lied, even when it was painful. And the letter turned into a compass for William, a last murmur from the mother he lost too soon, advising him to begin questioning the system rather than continuing to live within it. With history resounding more loudly than before, William took a step that nobody, especially Charles, anticipated. Silence is the crown's lifeblood. William, however, was not going back after experiencing the force of truth. He gave a daring ultimatum to senior royals in a private meeting. Either he leaves with Catherine and the kids at his side, or the monarchy changes. Tension was palpable in the air. Everything had been pushed to the limit by days of headlines, public demonstrations, and Diana's eerie letter. However, none of them foresaw William's next course of action. He wasn't only there to be heard at the emergency meeting. His purpose was to draw a line in the sand that the crown would not be permitted to cross without repercussions. William remained steadfast. No more hushed discussions. No more lying to the public in part. He made 3 explicit demands: a public admission of the pain caused by internal silence, complete transparency in future royal health matters, and, most controversially, a formal review of succession norms to ensure that heirs are never again sacrificed for the sake of appearance. Already shattered by weeks of pressure, the chamber exploded. The first person to criticize him was Camilla, who apparently got up from her chair and insisted that William was emotionally endangering the monarchy. Anger cracked in her voice, which was usually restrained. She charged him with being self-centered and prioritizing his own suffering over the stability of the country. William remained silent. He didn't have to. His quiet told it all. Charles saw himself caught between 2 different conceptions of fatherhood, the dad and the sovereign. He pleaded with William to change his mind, to allow time for the institution to adapt. William, however, had endured enough waiting. His wife, his kids, and the very legacy Diana forewarned about had already suffered from the passage of time. Princess Anne then reportedly expressed her unwavering support, much to the astonishment of many. In a rare moment of solidarity with William, she said that if the system kept rewarding repression and punishing honesty, it would not be viable. The room's temperature was altered by her words. She wasn't merely supporting her nephew. She was standing up for a future she thought could no longer be controlled by tradition alone. Catherine was standing behind this courageous front. Despite not being present at the summit, her impact was evident. Several sources claim that Catherine wrote the final draft of the speech that William would shortly give. Each word was chosen with care, each word honed by the suffering they had shared. It wasn't speechwriters or royal staff. It was their truth, her voice, William's ultimatum went beyond simply resigning from his royal obligations. It was about creating a new model for the monarchy that was guided by compassion, integrity, and defense, not preservation at all. He clarified it. He wouldn't stay under the crown if it couldn't change, and he wouldn't go quietly if he did. As William left, the room fell silent in shock, not with reluctance or rage, but with decisiveness. A future monarch who had outgrown the regulations established by people who were too scared to confront reality. The world held its breath until William spoke again, this time in the role of a father, rather than a prince. Prince William stood in front of the Union Jack and spoke to the world. His eyes gleamed, his voice forceful. He spoke as a guy who refused to let silence ruin what he loved, not as a king. What came next wasn't only a speech. It marked the beginning of a new period of royal life. There was no staged choreography or fanfare. William alone, standing on a platform that was originally intended to uphold royalty, but is now being used to call for reform. He began by speaking honestly, without pretentious language or court-approved expressions. He claimed that they could no longer bear the tragedy in silence. They had been instructed for far too long to keep secrets safe out of loyalty and to use routine to cover up anguish. However, they almost lost themselves in the process. While the facility urged them to remain silent, he described having restless nights and seeing Catherine crumble under the weight of parental worry. He referred to Louis as a youngster rather than as a future title, a child whose future and health had become the focus of rumors and backup plans in the boardroom. Embrace? He talked about Charlotte and George, who were compelled to grin as their family disintegrated behind the royal walls. Then the announcement was made. The royal duties of William and Catherine would be temporarily relegated, in reprioritization, not rebellion. Without hesitation, he stated that his children's welfare was more valuable than any title, and their truth was more valuable than any legacy. He claimed that the choice was made for protection rather than retreat. It wasn't merely a ritualistic resignation, though. It was a manifesto. William laid out his plans for the monarchy's future, one that prioritized humanity before hierarchy, integrity over heritage, a crown that did not require service in return for emotional sacrifice, one that welcomed change, not only stamina. Catherine stood beside him as he spoke. Steady, steadfast. She took his hand in one. She held George's in the other. The picture was symbolic rather than contrived. This was more than just a royal couple speaking to the country. A family was taking back its voice. The entire world was silent. Then there was a roar of response. Celebrities, world leaders, and even old detractors commended the speech for its conviction, bravery, and authenticity. The public believed the royal family was real for the first time in years. As an institution, no. However, as humans, we must navigate extreme suffering. Change stirred within the castle, gradually, and not without opposition. However, something had changed. Once reverberating through its corridors, the silence now seems narrower, more brittle. The monarchy was no longer paralyzed, but it was still unsettled. It had been made to pay attention. William refrained from speaking in order to uphold custom. To save his family, he spoke. And he might have saved something more in the process, the potential for a healing monarchy rather than a hiding one. One truth, however, remained hidden in the background, despite the audience's thunderous cheers. Everything has already been altered by the price of silence. Thank you for viewing. Remember to subscribe and like, and we'll see you in the next one.